In 1852, South Carolina's Beaufort County had a very successful cotton farm. Here, unsaid rules decided who lived and who died. Between the big houses and the slave cabins, real power wasn't just about land or cotton. It was measured in pure fear. This story is about a strange way of getting even. It's a story of waiting, planned justice, and the small step between staying alive and getting revenge. It all started with a young slave, Simon, a pack of hungry dogs, and 2 decades of quiet, built-up hate. What took place at the Harding plantation in that cold 1852 winter would change how everyone in the area saw the difference between being civilized and being savage. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And if this is your first time here, subscribe and hit the bell icon for more videos that will make you think for days. Because the way Simon used those hounds to get his payback, well, some plans are so careful it takes many years to find them out. And when the facts finally come out, it's already too late for everyone. In the bitter cold of 1852, Beaufort County, South Carolina, was the location of some of the richest cotton farms in the state. The Harding plantation was one of them. It was known for more than just its good land. It was known for something much darker. They regularly used bloodhounds to chase slaves who ran away. These dogs, taught to follow the smell of a person, were pure terror for anyone who hoped to be free. The story I am going to share was hidden for many, many years. It was only whispered by former slaves who kept their secrets until it was safe to talk. It's a tale that shows how a cruel system can create plans for revenge that are as careful as they are terrible. A search started because 2 people went missing. It ended with truths that shocked the powerful people of the whole area. This is not just one more story about slavery in America. It is the story of how hate, when it grows quietly for years, can blow up in ways that make us question what justice and revenge really are. What happened at the Harding plantation in December 1852 was never officially solved. But the truth, like it always does, came out from the people who survived to tell the tale. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And if this is your first time here, subscribe and hit the bell icon for more videos about stories that official history wanted to forget. The Harding plantation covered 800 acres by the Combahee River. Its rich fields grew long staple cotton for factories in northern England. But the thing that really described Ernest Harding's farm wasn't its amazing crops. It was the 6 bloodhounds that lived in special pens near the main house. These animals, weighing 80 to 100 pounds each, were tools of mental fear, just as powerful as any chain or whip. Ernest Harding, 50 years old, got the farm from his father. He made the farm bigger and made his control methods harsher. He was a tall man with a cold look in his eyes. He thought harsh punishment was the only thing slaves could understand. His son Jasper, 25, was shaped to be just like him, mean, sneaky, and with no feeling for others. Father and son ran the farm with total control, and the bloodhounds were their strongest weapon to keep people afraid. The dogs were taught as puppies to follow the exact human smell of the slaves. If someone tried to run, the dogs were let loose with a piece of that person's clothes to give them the scent. What happened when the dogs found the runaway was not something people talked about. But the screams that came from the woods during those chases were a steady warning to all the other slaves about the cost of not obeying. Simon was not like the other slaves, even as a child. He was born on the farm in 1832. From a young age, he showed he was very smart and very good at watching things. At 14, most boys were sent to the cotton fields, but Simon was given the job of taking care of the bloodhounds. Ernest Harding himself made this choice. He thought the boy had a special bond with the animals. Simon's job was to feed the dogs, clean their pens, and get them ready for a chase. He learned how to make scent traps, understand how the dogs acted, and keep the animals just hungry enough to make them more fierce during a hunt. After a while, he was the only slave on the farm who could go near the bloodhounds anytime. This role gave him a special place and let him move around in a way other slaves could not. The trust Ernest and Jasper had in Simon was total. They thought he was the perfect house slave, quiet, doing what he was told, and seeming thankful for his special job. Simon never argued with orders, never fought back, and always did his work like a machine. This mask of loyalty was built very carefully over many years. Every move he made was planned to make them think he could be trusted completely. But behind the bowing eyes and bent back, Simon held a hate that grew like a sickness. He watched everything. He watched the family's habits, how they moved around the farm, and the weaknesses of every Harding family member. His special job let him get information no other slave could. He stored every single detail in his mind like a careful army planner. Life on the Harding farm had a cruel and set pace. The 22 slaves got up before the sun, woken by a bell that Jasper rang himself. He thought doing this showed his power. Breakfast was just thin corn mush and, on a good day, a small bit of bad bacon. The work lasted from when the sun came up until it went down. There was only one short break in the middle of the day for another tiny meal. Punishments on the farm were done in public and were very planned. They were meant to not only hurt the person who broke a rule, but to scare everyone else. A wooden post stood in the middle of the slave yard. It was stained with the blood of many people. The whippings were done by Lioness Garrett, the overseer. He was a 35-year-old man known for being mean, even for that time. Garrett used a whip made of braided leather with metal bits on the end that could rip off pieces of skin with every hit. Simon saw hundreds of these punishments over the years. He was forced to watch, just like all the other slaves. He learned to keep his face blank while he watched men and women get broken for tiny mistakes, being late to the field, breaking a tool, or just looking the wrong way at a harding. Every scream, every beg for kindness, every drop of blood was saved in his memory. It was all fuel for the anger that burned inside him. On cold December nights, when being so tired should have made him sleep, Simon stayed awake. He was planning. He learned the schedules for the night guards. He studied how the dogs acted in different kinds of weather. He watched the paths Ernest and Jasper took when they left the farm. The deep winter cold had shifted some of the daily habits on the farm. This made new chances, and Simon watched them with sharp interest. When the hard winter of 1852 arrived, it changed the farm's daily life a lot. The work days got shorter because of the cold, but life in the slave cabins got even harder. Ernest and Jasper seemed very happy with the money they made that year. They talked out loud about their plans to make the farm bigger next year. While they talked, Simon found out they were planning a trip to Charleston at the start of December. They were using the quiet time after the crops were picked. What Simon did not know was that Ernest was starting to see small changes in how some slaves were acting. The owner saw people staring longer, heard whispers that stopped when he got close, and felt a tension in the air he almost couldn't place. He was naturally suspicious, and years of ruling by fear made it worse. He started to wonder if a plot was building among the slaves. He had told Lioness Garrett to watch everyone more closely, especially at night. You could feel the tension on the farm in those December days. The slaves worked in the biting cold. They were always being watched. The punishments for any mistake got even worse. Simon kept up his mask of being quiet and doing what he was told. But inside, he felt the time was coming. Every day that went by brought him closer to carrying out a plan he had been working on for 3 years. He was just waiting for the right moment, which the cold winter would soon give him. The terrible event that changed Simon's life started in the winter of 1849. His sister, Elelena, was just 17. She worked in the main house as a servant. She cleaned rooms and washed the Harding family's clothes. Elelena was a very beautiful young woman. She had bright eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest days in the slave cabins. Her being there gave hope to everyone who all lived with cruelty and sadness. The farm's old overseer, Morai Thorne, was a 40-year-old man. He was known for being extra cruel even for those days. He was not like Lioness Garrett, the man who took his place. Thorne got a sick joy not just from physical pain, but from sexually shaming the female slaves. He had made a twisted system. He would pick young slave women for his own special uses, and Ernest Harding always quietly allowed it. Elelena tried to fight off Thorne for weeks, but a teenaged slave girl trying to stop a white man with power was not just pointless, it was unsafe. Thorne's threats were clear and awful. He promised to let the bloodhounds eat Simon alive if she kept saying no. This awful threat worked. Elelena gave in to the abuse to keep her brother safe. The abuse went on for months. It was always a secret, and it always came with worse and worse threats. Thorne made Elelena meet him in different places on the farm, in the barn at night, in the big house when the family was gone, and even in the woods near the dog pens. This was his sick way of reminding her of his threats. Every time it happened, it left deep marks on the young woman, not just on her body, but in her mind. Simon saw the changes in his sister long before he knew why. Elelena had always been talkative and loving. Now she was quiet and kept to herself. She wouldn't look people in the eye, she jumped at loud sounds, and she started to wash her hands over and over. When Simon tried to ask her what was wrong, Elelena would talk about something else or just leave. She was carrying a heavy weight she would not share. They found out Elelena was pregnant at the end of summer 1849. She could not hide the changes in her body anymore. The news went fast through the slave cabins, but no one dared to guess out loud who the father was. Everyone knew that asking about a pregnancy of a young, pretty slave could bring harsh punishment to everybody. Being quiet was a way for them all to protect themselves. Simon watched this silence with a growing anger. Ernest Harding's reaction to Elelena's pregnancy was cold and businesslike, just like all his choices. To him, a pregnant slave was a future asset, but also a problem right now. His answer, he thought, was easy and would make him money. He would sell her to another farm before she was too far along. He made the choice without asking anyone. It was like Alelina was just a thing to be sold. The sale was set up so fast it shocked all the slaves. Not even a week after they found out, a slave trader from Savannah came to the farm with all the papers ready. Alelina was checked over like an animal. Her teeth were checked, her muscles were felt, and her pregnancy was confirmed in a shameful checkup in front of men she didn't know. The price was set at $800. Ernest thought this was a good price to fix the problem. Simon watched his sister get sold from outside the big house. He had to keep his face blank while his whole world fell apart. He saw Alelina put in chains with other slaves in the trader's wagon. Her eyes met his one last time before they took her away for good. In that second, something deep inside Simon snapped. The pain of losing her turned into a cold, planning anger that would shape every day of his life from then on. Dorinda, who was Simon and Alelina's mother, never got over losing her daughter. She was 44 years old. She had lived through decades of slavery. She lost her husband, who was sold to another farm when Simon was just a kid. She had put up with so much shame and hardship. But Alelina being sold was a pain she could not heal from. Dorinda started to fade away. She would not eat right and stopped caring about anything around her. Dorinda died in early March 1850. It was 6 months after Alelina was sold. She died quietly in the night, almost like she just chose to stop fighting. Simon found his mother's body the next morning. She was cold and stiff, and her face looked peaceful, so different from the pain she had been in for months. The burial was a small service in the field used as the slave graveyard. It was a wet, muddy spot at the back of the farm where many unnamed people had been buried. After his mother died, Simon changed completely. On the outside, he kept up the same mask of being quiet and obedient that he always had. But on the inside, he had changed into something far more unsafe. He was a man with nothing left to lose and only one goal. He started watching Morai Thorne with a new focus. He studied his habits, his paths, and his weaknesses. The chance to move against Thorne came in the summer of 1850. The overseer was found dead, and it was not clear what happened. His body was found in the woods near the farm. It looked like he had an accident while hunting alone. The official report said Thorne had tripped and hit his head on a rock, but there were troubling things that were never really explained. There were wounds that looked like they came from animal teeth, and the farm's bloodhounds were acting very strange and excited that morning. Simon was never asked about Thorne's death. Many people could confirm he was on the farm all night, but those who knew him best saw a small change in him after it happened. He seemed more calm, more centered, like a heavy load had been lifted off him. Thorne's death gave Simon a brief feeling of relief, but Simon knew the real person to blame for destroying his family was still alive and doing well. Lioness Garrett was hired as the new overseer a few weeks after Thorne died. Garrett was just as mean, but his cruelty was more like a system and less for his own sick enjoyment. He saw being brutal as a tool he needed for his job, not as something to enjoy. This change made life on the farm a little easier to predict, but it was still just as cruel. The punishments kept happening, the abuse went on, and the system of fear caused by the bloodhounds was still in place. For the next 2 years, Simon got better and better at being unseen and watching. He became a student of how people acted. He studied every member of the Hardin G family like a scientist studying an insect. Ernest had the same habits every day and was overly confident he was safe. Jasper was reckless and mean, but he was also sloppy and easy to fool. Adelaide, the youngest daughter, was a mystery. Simon watched her with growing interest. When the hard winter of 1852 came, it brought a feeling that something big was about to shift. Simon could feel the change coming, like an animal can feel a storm before the sky gets dark. He had spent 3 years planning, watching, and waiting for the perfect chance. Now, Ernest and Jasper's yearly trip to Charleston was coming up. The deep cold made the perfect situation for keeping evidence fresh for a short time. Simon knew his moment had finally come. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more videos to follow what happens next in this troubling case. Adelaide Harding came back to the Harding farm at the start of December 1852. She had just finished her school at the Charleston Female Seminary. At 19, she was no longer a spoiled girl. She was a young woman with new ideas that would deeply upset her family. In her 3 years of school, Adelaide had learned about abolitionist ideas. These ideas were passed around quietly in some smart groups in Charleston. They planted seeds of doubt in her mind about the very system that made her family rich. Simon noticed the change in Adelaide. He watched her closely since she got back. She now asked questions about how the farm was run. She said she was uncomfortable with the cruel punishments, and she showed a kindness for the slaves that was totally new for a Harding. At dinner, Her questions about how the slaves were doing made Ernest and Jasper clearly tense. This created cracks in the family, and Simon watched with great interest. Ernest Harding felt annoyed and stubborn about the changes in his daughter. He blamed her dangerous ideas on her teachers in Charleston. He was sure that if she just saw slavery up close, it would fix her silly daydreams about ending it. His answer was simple and harsh. Ernest made Adelaide watch the public whippings. He thought seeing it for herself would make her see that the slaves were beneath her. The first punishment Adelaide had to watch after she came home was for a slave named Joshua. He was 18 and was accused of taking bacon from the kitchen. The charge was probably a lie. It was just Lioness Garrett's word. But that didn't matter in the farm's way of justice. Joshua was tied to the post in the middle of the slave yard. All the other slaves had to make a circle and watch. Adelaide was put in a chair next to her father and brother. The chair was brought from the big house just for this. Ernest quietly told her she had to learn how to keep order. He said if she showed any weakness, the slaves would think they could walk all over her because she was a woman. Jasper added with a mean smile that teaching slaves was a skill that needed a strong hand. He said Adelaide needed to get tougher. Lioness Garrett carried out the punishment with his normal skill. Every time the whip hit, Joshua screamed. The sound bounced around the yard as blood started to run down the young man's back. Adelaide watched the first 5 hits without a sound. But when the 6th hit ripped a piece of skin from Joshua's back, she got sick. She bent over and threw up, her body unable to handle the awful thing she was seeing. Ernest showed no pity for his daughter. Instead, he made her stay in her chair until all 20 hits were done. He grabbed her arm tightly when she tried to stand. Jasper laughed at her. He said Adelaide was too soft to be a real Harding. This public shaming of Adelaide in front of the slaves made things very complicated. Simon watched all of it with sharp interest. In the next few days, Ernest made Adelaide's lessons even harder. He forced her to walk with Lioness Garrett on his daily checks and watch other punishments. Each one left Adelaide more upset. But it also made her more certain that the whole system was evil. Instead of making her tougher like Ernest wanted, the events made her believe even more in ending slavery. It made her determined to find ways to help the slaves. What Ernest didn't see was that his plan was doing the exact opposite of what he wanted. Adelaide started asking very specific questions about how the farm was run. She questioned the methods and the very idea of owning people. She found out from talking to house slaves about the sexual abuse that happened with Thorne, and that sometimes still happened with Garrett. Learning this horrified her and made her even more sure she had to do something. Things finally exploded when Adelaide tried to stop a punishment. A young slave named Mercy was accused of breaking a fancy plate in the big house. Jasper said she must get 10 hits. When Lioness Garrett lifted the whip for the first strike, Adelaide jumped up from her chair. She yelled, "Stop!" with a power that shocked everyone there, even herself. The fight that happened next was huge. Jasper was red-faced, angry that his sister had stepped in. He yelled that she was embarrassing the family and telling the slaves it was okay to disobey. Ernest agreed with his son. He said Adelaide had gone crazy and had to be stopped before she ruined all the order on the farm. Adelaide fought back. She called her father and brother monsters. She said she would never watch another punishment again. The family argument went on for hours in the big house. Their voices were so loud they could be heard in the slave cabins. Adelaide threatened to write to their family in Charleston about the awful things she was being made to see. Ernest threatened to lock her in her room until she calmed down. Jasper said they should send Adelaide to a hospital for crazy women. She knew this was a real threat, as her family was known for taking big steps. Simon saw that this family fighting was the exact distraction he needed to carry out his plan. Ernest and Jasper were so busy trying to fix Adelaide that they stopped paying attention to the farm's normal business. They were always arguing about how to handle Adelaide's defiance. This meant they were not watching other things. It made them weak and less careful. What Simon did not know was that Adelaide was starting to guess that the slaves were planning something. Her new awareness of how wrong things were made her notice small actions among the slaves. She saw meaningful looks pass between certain slaves. She heard talks that stopped cold when she came near, and she felt a growing tightness that seemed to be centered on Simon and Joshua. She didn't know what was happening, but Adelaide felt that a big change was coming. Ernest and Jasper decided to go on their yearly trip to Charleston. Part of the reason was to ask other farm owners what to do about Adelaide. They planned to talk about it with men who had experience and could give them tips on how to manage a daughter who wouldn't obey. The trip would also be a needed rest from the fighting at home. It would let them focus on money and leave Adelaide by herself to think about how she was acting. As they got ready for the trip, Simon saw that Ernest and Jasper were less careful than normal about their plans. They talked out loud about when they would leave, exactly where they were going, and how long they would be gone. Simon quietly soaked up all this information while he took care of the hounds near the big house. The deep winter cold had changed some of their normal habits, which created chances that Simon watched with great interest. The night before Ernest and Jasper left, there was one final family argument about Adelaide. Ernest gave clear orders that Lioness Garrett was to watch her while he was gone. He said any bad behavior must be reported to him as soon as he got back. Adelaide replied that she would use the time alone to think about the evil system that made their family rich. This statement clearly upset Ernest. Simon stayed awake all that last night. He went over every single part of his plan in his mind. He had waited 3 years for this chance. He knew he would not get another one. The bitter cold made the perfect setting for keeping evidence good for a few days. That was enough time to get his revenge and get rid of the proof. In just a few hours, the revenge he had so carefully planned would finally happen. And this time, he would be in charge of what happened to his masters. Ernest and Jasper Harding left the farm on the cold morning of December 10, 1852. They were in a carriage filled with cotton samples and business papers for their yearly trip to Charleston. The path they took was one everyone knew. It was a dirt road that twisted through pine and oak woods for about 8 miles before it hit the main road. The deep winter cold had made the road hard, but also more unsafe because of ice in the shady spots. Simon had studied this path very carefully for years. He walked it while doing his farm jobs. He learned every turn, every down tree, and every spot where the woods got thicker. He knew the exact place where the road went through a very lonely area just a mile from the big house. There, the trees made a roof so thick that sunlight could barely get through, even in the day. The spot was perfect. It was close enough to make moving things easy, but lonely enough to be private. On the morning they left, Simon did his normal job of caring for the hounds. But there was a small change in how he acted that only the dogs seemed to notice. They were more excited than usual. They sniffed the air hard and watched Simon with a focus that looked like they were waiting for something. After he finished his morning work, he quietly went to an old, unused barn at the back of the farm. This was where he had hidden the tools he would need. The set of tools Simon had gathered was simple, but it would work. He had a wood-cutting axe, 2 sharp meat knives he had taken from the main kitchen, strong ropes, and a tarp that wouldn't leak, which he would use to move the bodies. Most important of all, he had found an old bear trap at the far end of the farm. It was a rusty iron trap that had been forgotten for years. Simon had cleaned it and tested it in secret at night. He found out it still worked just fine. Simon's plan was harsh and simple, but it needed perfect timing. It also needed help from Joshua, the young slave who was whipped so badly in front of Adelaide weeks ago. Joshua had lived through the whipping, but the marks on his body and in his mind had changed him. He was now ready to risk it all to get even. In quiet talks in the slave cabins, Simon had gotten Joshua to be his partner. He promised him a chance to help destroy the men who had hurt them. About an hour after Ernest and Jasper left, Simon and Joshua went through the woods to the spot they had picked for the attack. The deep cold made their breath show in the air, but it also quieted all the sounds. This made a dead silence that was perfect for what they had to do. They carefully placed the old trap on the road, covering it with leaves and sticks. Then they hid on different sides of the road, behind huge old trees. The noise of the carriage coming closer bounced through the woods about 20 minutes later. Simon could hear Ernest and Jasper talking normally about their business. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The cold had made the horses move slower and more carefully. This made the carriage move at a speed that was perfect for the trap Simon had set. When the front wheel of the carriage rolled over the hidden trap, the trap snapped shut with a loud metal sound that rang through the woods. The horses jumped up in fear. This made the carriage flip over hard, throwing Ernest and Jasper onto the cold, hard ground. Ernest yelled out in pain as the trap smashed his ankle. Jasper was dizzy from the fall and tried hard to figure out what was happening. Simon and Joshua came out from their hiding spots at the same time. They moved like skilled hunters. Simon leaped onto Jasper. He hit him with the handle of the axe before Jasper could even fight back. Joshua went for Ernest, who was stuck in the trap. He used a rope to gag him before his yells could travel too far in the woods. In under 5 minutes, both men were tied up and helpless. The killing was careful and slow. Simon wanted both men to know exactly what was happening. He wanted them to know why they were dying. He started by quietly telling them how they had ruined his family. He reminded them of every unfair act, every time they shamed someone, every bit of pain they had caused. Ernest and Jasper were scared and tied up. They could only listen. As Simon listed their crimes one by one, Joshua took an active part in the killing. He used the knives to make cuts that caused a lot of pain but did not kill them right away. He had watched animals being butchered on the farm for years. He used that basic knowledge now with awful skill. The deep winter cold helped slow down the bleeding. This made the men suffer for longer than they would have in warmer weather. When Simon finally dealt the last fatal hits, he felt a mix of things: happiness, relief, and a strange, empty feeling. The revenge was done. But he knew the hardest part of his plan was next, getting rid of all proof of the murders. The bitter cold made a perfect way to keep the meat fresh for a day or two. It was just enough time to feed it to the bloodhounds without anyone guessing. Moving fast in the biting cold, Simon and Joshua started to cut up the bodies. They used the sharp knives they had with them. The work was rough and awful. They weren't trying to be neat, just making rough cuts to get the bodies into pieces they could carry. The cold made the job harder, but it also made it cleaner with less blood spilling onto the ground. The horses for the carriage had run off in fear during the attack, but Simon had planned for that. Horses running loose would be found sooner or later, but with no carriage and no riders, it would make people confused about what took place. Simon and Joshua carefully broke the carriage apart. They smashed it into small bits and spread them all over the woods in different places. They buried some of the pieces in the wet mud, which was getting soft from a recent rain. Ernest's and Jasper's clothes and other items were gathered up. They were hidden in different spots in the woods, far from where the attack happened. Simon knew that someday some of these things might be found. But since they were spread out so far and buried in mud, they would just make any search more confusing, not clearer. They carried the cut-up flesh back to the farm in 2 trips that afternoon. Simon and Joshua carried the tarp through the woods to the old barn where they had kept the tools. The deep cold helped keep the meat fresh, but Simon knew he had to work fast before it went bad. They stored the pieces for a short time in salt barrels. Simon had taken these from the main house weeks before. For the next 2 days, Simon went back to his normal jobs. He was so calm it even surprised him. He fed the bloodhounds their regular food, but now he mixed in small bits of human flesh with it. The deep cold had made the dogs extra hungry, and they ate up the new meat eagerly. They didn't act in any way that would make someone suspicious. Joshua also stuck to his normal life. He worked in the fields, even in the bitter cold. He was careful not to do anything that would make people look at him. The teamwork between the 2 men had been perfect. They both knew that to survive, they had to keep what happened in the woods a total secret. The cold weather gave them a good reason for acting a little different, like shaking or moving more slowly. Adelaide saw that Simon seemed more at ease than usual in the days after her father and brother left, but she thought it was just relief. She figured he was happy he didn't have to be part of the cruel lessons Ernest had forced on her. She was also using the time her father and brother were gone to make changes on the farm. She stopped the public punishments and made life in the slave cabins better. This made the farm feel calmer, which accidentally helped Simon act normal. 10 days went by after Ernest and Jasper Harding left. Because they were gone so long, people on the farm started to get truly worried. Lioness Garrett had at first liked being in charge without his bosses watching him. But now he had real problems that he did not have the power to solve. Local businessmen had shown up to make deals with Ernest, and a pile of letters was growing that needed answers right away. Adelaide was worried too, but for other reasons. Even though she disagreed with her father and brother about so much, she couldn't believe they would stay in Charleston this long. They would have at least sent a letter to say why they were late. Ernest was very careful about his business letters, and Jasper always checked in with the family when he was away. No news at all was not like them. This was especially true after the family fights they had right before the trip. Garrett decided to do something. He would go look for Ernest and Jasper himself. On the morning of December 20th, he got on his horse and left. He planned to follow the same path the 2 men had taken. He would stop at towns and inns on the way to Charleston. The deep cold made the trip risky, but Garrett was truly worried about his bosses. He was set on finding out what happened. Garrett's search uncovered some upsetting news. In Beaufort, the closest town, he found out that Ernest and Jasper never got there, and they had left the farm with plenty of time to make the trip in a single day. The owner of the inn where they always stayed said they had no booking and had not sent any word. The local businessmen they were supposed to meet also said they never showed up for their meetings. Worried by this, Garrett widened his search to other towns on the way to Charleston. At every place he stopped, it was the same story. Nobody had seen Ernest and Jasper Harding after they left their farm. It was like the 2 men had just disappeared off the planet somewhere between the Harding farm and the first town. This news turned Garrett's worry into real fear. He was especially scared because of the growing talk about abolitionists working in the area. The overseer got back to the farm on the afternoon of December 23rd. The news he brought left Adelaide clearly shaken. The thought that something awful had happened to her father and brother was terrible, even with all their problems. Adelaide told Garrett right away to call the local sheriff and set up a real search. She also sent quick messages to her family in Charleston, hoping they had heard from the two men. The county sheriff, Thomas Whitmore, showed up at the farm on the morning of December 25th. He brought two deputies and a local tracker named Ezra Collins. Whitmore was 45 and had been an investigator for many years. He was known for being very careful and for getting information out of people who didn't want to talk. His being there made everyone on the farm tense, both the slaves and the white workers. The search started with long questions for Adelaide, Lioness Garrett, and the other white people working on the farm. Whitmore wanted to make a clear timeline of Ernest and Jasper's last days. He wanted to know if they acted strangely. He also wanted to see if there was any reason they might have changed their travel plans on purpose. The answers he got showed two men who were just following their normal plan, but who were also having clear family fights over Adelaide's behavior. Ezra Collins, the tracker, started his search on the road Ernest and Jasper had used. He looked for any sign they had been there or any proof of trouble. The job was hard because it had rained in the past. Few days which washed away a lot of clues, but Collins was good at tracking. He found marks from carriage wheels on the road near the farm, but the marks got harder and harder to see the farther he got from the property. About 1 mile from the farm, in the loneliest part of the road, Collins found something troubling. There were clear signs that something violent had taken place right there. The ground was all torn up and muddy. There were snapped branches on the trees nearby. And there were dark spots on the ground that were definitely blood. Even more, he found bits of rusty metal that looked like they came from an old trap. He also found scraps of cloth stuck on bushes that looked like the clothes Ernest and Jasper were wearing when they left. Finding these clues changed everything. What started as a search for missing people was now a murder investigation. Whitmore ordered a wide search of the area. He got more men from other farms to help. For the next 2 days, they combed the woods all around the spot. They found more proof that confirmed something awful had happened there. The searchers found more pieces of clothing spread through the woods. Some of them had human blood on them. They also found what was left of Ernest and Jasper's carriage. It was hidden in a deep ditch about half a mile off the road. The carriage had been broken on purpose and hidden. This showed that whoever did this had tried to get rid of the proof. Even more upsetting, they found human bones. They were buried just under the dirt in different parts of the woods. Finding the bones was a mystery that confused the searchers. The bones were spread all over. Some had marks on them that looked like they were cut with rough tools, and many of the smaller bones were just gone. Whitmore asked the local doctor, Dr. Harrison, to look. He checked the bones and said they looked human. He also said the marks on them matched being cut up with knives or axes in a rough way. What interested Whitmore the most was how rough, but smart, the crime was. Using an old trap showed they grabbed a chance. They weren't fancy planners. The rough way the bodies were cut up showed a basic knowledge of butchering animals, and the simple way the proof was spread around showed a desperate try to hide what they did. It was clear he was not chasing skilled criminals. He was chasing people who were filled with deep anger and a need to get even. Whitmore started asking harder questions. He focused on the idea that the slaves had planned this together. He asked every person on the farm about who was friends with whom, any reasons for violence, and if they knew about any plans to run away or fight back. The answers he got were all vague. Every slave said they knew nothing about what happened or who might have helped. Joshua, the young man who was whipped so badly weeks ago, was questioned many times. Whitmore was clearly suspicious that he was part of it. The sheriff saw that Joshua was extremely nervous, more than just the normal fear a slave would have. He wouldn't look the sheriff in the eye. His hands were shaking so much you could see it, and he held himself in a tense way that hinted he felt very guilty. But Joshua stuck to his story. He said he knew nothing and wasn't involved. The search for more proof led the men to the bloodhound pens. There they found something that gave them the last piece of the puzzle. In and around the dog pens, they found tiny bits of human bones. They were buried just under the frozen dirt. Dr. Harrison looked at these bits and said they seemed to be human, but he couldn't be 100% sure without better ways of testing, which they didn't have back then. Finding pieces of bone in the bloodhound pens added a new level of horror to the case. Whitmore now knew he was dealing with a crime so cruel it was beyond anything he had ever seen. Using the farm's own dogs to get rid of the proof showed a deep knowledge of the property. It also showed a cold, planning mind that pointed straight to someone in the slave community. Simon was questioned just like all the other slaves on the farm, but his special job as the dog keeper made him a key person to talk to. Whitmore really wanted to know if Simon had seen the dogs acting strangely in the days after Ernest and Jasper went missing. Simon answered with the right amount of meekness. He explained that the dogs had been normal. They were just a little more hungry because of the deep winter cold, which he said was normal for this time of year. While searching the slave cabins, the investigators found some proof that made them suspicious of Simon. In his small house, they found tiny blood spots on his clothes. But when they asked him about it, Simon explained he had butchered a pig a few days ago to feed the hounds. This was a normal thing to do in winter, and other slaves agreed. The story made sense, but it didn't completely clear the sheriff's doubts. When shown the proof from his cabin and told about the bones by the pens, Simon stuck to his story of knowing nothing, but his body started to show he was feeling the pressure. Whitmore was good at reading people who were stressed. He could tell that Simon was hiding something important, but he had no hard proof that tied Simon to the killings, and he didn't know who helped him. The sheriff could not arrest him. The investigation hit a wall. It became clear that all the slaves were protecting Simon by staying quiet together. Every slave who was questioned told the same story. They knew nothing. They saw nothing strange, and they didn't know about any plan to be violent. This quiet wasn't just because they were afraid of the sheriff. It was their way of protecting each other. They understood that Simon had done something that many of them secretly supported. Whitmore tried to make them talk. He offered money for information and threatened to punish everyone, but nothing worked. The slaves stayed together, determined to protect Simon and Joshua. They did this even though they knew it could lead to terrible things for all of them. This unity completely stopped the sheriff's work. It showed just how much hate there was for the Harding family. On the night of January 12th, after a full week of searching, Simon and Joshua vanished from the farm. They were found to be missing the next morning when Simon did not show up to feed the hounds. This was a job he had never once missed in 8 years. A quick search of the farm and the woods around it found no trace of them. It was like they had just disappeared into the cold night air. Simon and Joshua running away at the same time proved to Whitmore that they had planned it. But it also killed any chance of fully solving the case. Without the main suspects to question, and with the slaves refusing to help, the investigation was stuck. Whitmore put out wanted posters and told the police in other states, but he knew the chances of catching the runaways were very low, especially in the hard winter. Adelaide was heartbroken. It wasn't just that her father and brother were dead, but that their murders were so cruel. Finding out that their own dogs had been used to get rid of the bodies caused a deep mental wound. It would stay with her for her whole life. She ordered that all 6 dogs be put down right away. She could not stand to have the animals around that had been part of her family's end. In the days after Simon and Joshua ran, Adelaide made a choice that stunned the whole area. On January 20, 1853, she signed legal papers that freed all 22 slaves on the Harding farm. She said she was disgusted by the system that made such awful things happen. She made this choice even though all her family and lawyers told her not to. It basically ruined the farm's money-making value and was the end of the Harding family's power in Beaufort County. Freeing all the slaves at once sent a shock across the area. It set a dangerous example that other slave owners worried would give people ideas. Adelaide was pushed out of local society. She ended up moving north. There, she joined the movement to end slavery and spent the rest of her life fighting it. She never got married and never went back to the South. She carried the mental scars of what happened in 1852 until she died. Sheriff Whitmore never officially solved the Harding plantation murder case, but he was sure he knew who did it. The case was left open because there was no hard proof and the suspects ran away. Whitmore stopped working a few years later, but he remained fixated on the case until he died. He always wondered about the exact details of how Simon and Joshua pulled off such a simple but perfect plan. The full truth of how Ernest and Jasper Harding were murdered stayed hidden for over 30 years. It was kept safe by the people who were freed by Adelaide's big decision. It wasn't until the late 1880s, when many of the old Harding slaves were near the end of their lives, that they started to share their stories. They told their children and grandchildren who had been born free. The truth came out in little bits, told quietly at family get-togethers and meetings. Each person added a piece to a puzzle that had been kept secret for decades. They talked about Simon and how he changed and became quiet after he lost his sister and mother. They told stories about the small signs they had seen in the days before Ernest and Jasper vanished. They talked about the feeling of tense waiting that filled the slave cabins that cold winter. The former slaves told how Simon got Joshua to be his partner. He used the young man's anger and his need for payback after the awful whipping. They explained how the 2 men had planned every part of the murders. This included finding and using the old trap and the rough way they got rid of the bodies by using the farm's own bloodhounds. Choosing the cold winter was not an accident. It was a smart choice to keep the meat fresh long enough to feed it to the dogs. The stories also told details about the group of people who protected Simon and Joshua during the investigation. Almost all the slaves knew about the revenge plan. Many had helped in small but important ways. They gave fake stories, got rid of small bits of proof, and stayed completely silent when questioned. This group's silence was not just about being afraid. It was a kind of justice for the whole community. They felt Simon's revenge was right. The stories explained how Simon used his deep knowledge of the bloodhounds to turn them into tools for erasing evidence. He fed them Ernest's and Jasper's flesh over 2 days. This plan worked so well that even when the sheriff found proof the dogs might have eaten human flesh, they could not prove it was connected to the murders. To the slave community, Simon and Joshua were not criminals. They were heroes. They brought justice when there was no other way to get it. They had risked their own lives to get payback, not just for their own families, but for all the wrong things done to every slave on that farm. The revenge was cruel, but it matched the years of cruelty they had all lived through under the Hardings. What finally happened to Simon and Joshua is still a mystery. Some stories say they made it to communities of free slaves that were starting in Florida. There, they lived the rest of their lives with new names. Other stories say they split up after they got away. Simon went north over the mountains, and Joshua went west. Neither one was ever seen in Beaufort County again. The Harding farm never came back from what happened in 1852. The land was finally split up and sold off. The big house was torn down in the early 1900s. Today, only a few stone foundations show where one of the richest farms in Beaufort County used to be. People who live nearby still stay away from that spot, especially on winter nights. They say they feel a strange, bad feeling there, which they blame on the violent memories that still stick to the place. The story of Simon and his revenge turned into a legend in black communities in the South. It was passed down from parents to children as a story about the awful parts of slavery and the cost of being held down. For the people who knew the real story, Simon was a sign of fighting back and of justice. He was a man who turned his pain into a plan and used his master's own weapons against them. In the words of one of the last people to live through the Harding farm, written down in 1895, Simon did what all of us wanted to do, but we were not brave enough. He showed us that even the strongest people can be brought down when justice finally arrives. He was our hero, our payback, and we will never forget what he did for us. This story reminds us that the official history books often leave out the voices of the people who lived through the darkest times. Only by listening to the quiet stories of those who survived can we piece together the full truth. These events shaped our world in ways we are only now starting to understand. What did you think of Simon's careful plan for revenge? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I enjoy reading what you think about these dark stories from America's past. If you liked this story, subscribe and hit the bell icon for more videos that look into the hidden parts of history.